Hi, Robbie.
How are you?
Just fine.
Good, you're looking good.
So good, go ahead.
You guys all look sharp. Robbie, you look great. Bob, you look great. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Trying to keep up with Robbie, man, that's tough.
He's a dapper dude, isn't he, Bob?
I know he is, man. You know,
Yep,
got the Brett Bear ties on.
But nobody keeps his boyish good looks like Bob Woodson, I'll tell you that.
That's right. That's right.
Nobody knows he's 65 years old.
That's right. That's right.
That's right.
Professor George, I mean, he's only 45. What are you talking about? Oh, that's wonderful.
Hey, Robbie, when you start getting old, you got to emphasize style over substance.
I completely agree. Notice how I'm dyeing my hair gray to get the respect of my students?
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. All right, well,
See, I didn't know how to dye, so I just cut it.
So you cut it off.
we are live on the stream, and as you can see, I am sitting here by myself, and thanks to
Let me
this.
turn my phone off. Go ahead.
Sure. Yep. All right, we are live, and as you can see, I don't know if you've heard, but there's this little thing called a pandemic going on, and there's also this other little thing called the legislative session going on, so we have had to adapt very quickly on the fly. From your perspective as the audience, I hope it seemed fairly seamless, but I do want to give a shout out to the audiovisual folks in the back who have just done an incredible job. Well, my name's Andrew Brown, and I have the privilege of overseeing child and family policy here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you all for being with us today, and I am unbelievably honored to be joined this morning by three leading minds of the conservative movement for a timely conversation about the challenges that our nation is facing and how institutions like family, religious communities, and civic organizations can help guide America to a brighter tomorrow. And this important conversation, which has been in the works for several months, has become even more critical in light of events that have unfolded in cities across the country over the last year, and just days ago in the halls of our nation's capital. A year marked by riots and last week's siege of the U.S. Capitol building threw a bright spotlight on the troubles that are ailing American democracy. My congressman and our former TPPF colleague, Congressman Chip Roy, clearly and concisely diagnosed the problem during a speech on the House floor last Wednesday night, just hours after order was restored. The problem we face, Congressman Roy said, is even bigger. We are deeply divided. We are divided about even life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words which used to bind us together now at times tear us apart because we disagree about what they even mean. And at the root of the division that Congressman Roy was discussing is a widespread sense of alienation among our fellow citizens, a feeling that they are an outsider in their own country, and that the institutions of society are working for others, but not for them. And the root causes of this alienation aren't hard to identify. Marriage and family formation rates are at historic lows. Church attendance has dropped by, according to some estimates, about 20% over the last 2 decades. Fewer than 1 in 3 Americans, according to Pew Research, know all or most of their neighbors. Americans are increasingly alienated and divided because we're increasingly disconnected from key institutions that have historically provided practical support and a sense of belonging. And we're filling the vacuum left with things that tragically exacerbate this sense of alienation and lead to even more destructive consequences. Many of you are probably discouraged right now and wondering if America's best days really are behind her. While I completely understand this feeling, our message today is this: take heart, have hope. America has all the tools necessary for building a stronger and better future. But it's going to take work from each and every one of us. And today we have one of the best, if not the best, group of conservative thinkers to help us rise to this challenge. I've long admired each of the men on this stage. They were going to be on the stage, now they're on the screen. But their work has profoundly influenced my own thinking and my own development as a conservative. Before I introduce our panelists, I also want to mention that each of our panelists today contributed a chapter to Making Government Work. This is a new book that Texas Public Policy Foundation was proud to work with Representative Parker on, and it provides a blueprint for building a stronger America. If you're interested in purchasing a copy, you can get one from makinggovernmentwork.com. And for those of you who are lucky enough to be here in person, we'll be holding a book signing with Representative Parker right after the keynote luncheon from 1:45 p.m. until 2:15 p.m., and that's going to be in room 115 just to the right as you exit this room. Now to introduce our panelists. Representative Tan Parker has served the people of Southwest Denton County in the Texas House of Representatives since 2007. As the editor of Making Government Work, it was his vision and tireless work that brought this ambitious project to fruition. Representative Parker is a proven conservative leader championing economic prosperity, job creation, border security, and the rights of children and other vulnerable populations. He's held numerous leadership positions in the Texas House, including 2 terms as chairman of the House Republican Caucus. Representative Parker is a graduate of the University of Dallas and the London School of Economics. He and his wife of 25 years, Beth, reside in Flower Mound, Texas with their 2 daughters. Robert Woodson Sr. is the founder and president of the Woodson Center and 1776 Unites. A staple of the conservative movement, Mr. Woodson is an influential national leader on issues of poverty alleviation and empowering disadvantaged communities to become agents of their own uplift. His social activism dates back to the 1960s when, as a young civil rights activist, he developed and coordinated national and local community revitalization programs. During the 1970s, he directed the National Urban League's Administration of Justice Division and later served as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Today, under his leadership, the Woodson Center seeks to transform lives, schools, and troubled neighborhoods from the inside out. He is the author of numerous books and an early recipient of the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Genius Award. Professor Robert George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. A respected social commentator and public intellectual, Professor George has served as chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the President's Council on Bioethics. He was a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. A Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Swarthmore, Professor George holds a Juris Doctorate and MTS degrees from Harvard University, multiple degrees from Oxford University, and 22 honorary doctorates. His most recent book is Conscience and Its Enemies, Confronting the Dogmas of Liberal Secularism. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. We want to start off by diagnosing the problem and setting up the ideas that we'll be discussing today. Representative Parker, in Making Government Work, you write, "We can judge the health of our nation in large part by looking at the health of our families." What is your view of the current state of the health of our families, communities, and nation?
Well, first of all, Andrew, thank you so much for moderating today. Thank you for putting all this together to our friends at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And I want to thank Bob and Robbie for being a part of this today as well, and their incredible participation in Making Government Work. It was a privilege to work with them and to work with all of you. In terms of diagnosing the current situation today, Andrew, my perspective, and you kind of commented on some of these statistical pieces, you know, there's good news and there's bad news. I'm an optimist, so I believe that the future is very bright for America and for the future of our families. But when you look specifically and you notice the fact that birth rates are down, if you look at the fact that the formation rate of marriages is down, those are real concerns for our society, because the family is the fundamental building block of society in my assessment. But I'll also tell you that there's great news. The number of abortions are down dramatically, which is extraordinary. The number of divorces are also down. So I think there's great reason for people that are social conservatives to be excited and motivated about the future. You know, when we target specific issues and specific topics, we can be effective in moving the needle. And that's really, I think, the core message for all of us today that are participating in this and listening, is that conservatives can be effective in our messaging. We just have got to be united, and we've got to be focused on accomplishing those tasks. But I think the future is bright for the family, despite the horrific strains and challenges that we see coming at us from all aspects of life, and the strains and attacks on the family and attacks on civil society that we have seen so often occur here during 2020. So again, I'm an optimist, and I think the future is bright, but I certainly look forward to my good friends Bob and Robbie giving their commentary on this most critical topic.
Professor George, our conversation today focuses on how strengthening key mediating institutions can reinvigorate the American dream. Briefly discuss the concept of mediating institutions and their historic role in American society.
You know, I'll be happy to do that, but if you will permit me, I do not want to speak ahead of Bob Woodson. Bob Woodson, absolutely, no, Bob. There is nobody in this country I admire more than Bob Woodson, because there's nobody in this country who has done more concretely on the ground to bring hope to people in need, people who are desperate, people who are hurting,
Amen,
than Bob Woodson.
Amen.
I speak as an academic, and I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to answer your question. But I want ahead of me to speak someone who doesn't speak simply as an academic, but someone who speaks from the experience of concretely helping people. So Bob, I'm going to shift this to you, and then I'll come back.
All right. Well, I'd like to maybe share with you my migration from liberal left Democrat civil rights activist to conservative. Because I was a young civil rights activist, and I became very disenchanted when we led demonstrations outside of a pharmaceutical company when they desegregated, that hired 9 black PhD chemists. When we approached them about joining our movement, they said they got these jobs because they were qualified. And so I realized there was a big gap, a bifurcation of the movement, and this happened repeatedly. And so I realized that many of the people who sacrificed and suffered most of the civil rights did not benefit from the change, and that there was a bait and switch game going on, where you use the demographics of those at the bottom who are struggling as the bait, and the switch occurs when with the resources arrive. And so I saw that. I also left the civil rights movement on the whole issue of force busing for integration, because I believe the opposite of segregation is not integration, it is desegregation. Because if you operate on the premise that separate is inherently unequal, you're saying that anything is black is all bad. And so that got me in trouble with the civil rights movement. But so I left the movement because I believe that the biggest separation in society is not racial, it is class. And that reality still exists today. And so I began to work on behalf of low-income people of all races, and to bring them into the mainstream. But Dr. King said, what good does it do to have the right to eat in a restaurant of your choice or to live in a neighborhood of your choosing if you don't have the means to exercise that right? So opportunity alone, expectation in the absence of opportunity is oppression. And so it's not enough to open the doors. You must provide people with the means to walk through the doors and take advantage of opportunities. And so what happened, though, is that many of the civil rights leaders became democratic political leaders running these cities. And then the poverty programs came on board, and they became very destructive and hostile to the family, because of the $22 trillion we've spent over the past 50 years. 70 cents of every dollar doesn't go to the poor, it goes to those who serve the poor. So, and they ask which problems are fundable, not which ones are solvable. And so very quickly, but there was a study done by Rachel and Don Warren, that one of the only social scientists that goes into low-income communities and asks questions about capacity. And they ask grassroots people, where do you turn to in times of trouble and in crisis? And they named the family, local, all the institutions that were in their own zip code. The last institution they turned to was a professional service provider. So for the past 50 years, we have delivered services through the institution of last choice of those in need, and that's why they have failed. Because when you impose solutions or impose any transplant into the human body, it rejects it no matter how well intended it is. And so what I realized that 2 out of 10 whites with a college education works for government, 6 out of 10 blacks. So the black middle class is anchored in a segment of society that is whose careers and depends upon having a dependent population. So no matter how well-intentioned you are, if your strategic interest is allied against the interests of the poor, you're going to have the mess that we have now. And so what I am seeking to do, and we want to discuss, are what are strategic relationships between conservatives and the poor that can really yield a benefit for both and for society in general. But conservatives have made it difficult for that process to occur, and that's something that we need to discuss. What are the steps necessary to bring about a confluence of interests that can to develop a new coalition in America to refresh and restore this nation? I believe it's possible if we will just so engage.
Great thinkers from Edmund Burke to Alexis de Tocqueville to contemporary sociologists who are doing work and social theorists who are doing work in this field have recognized that the original and best Department of Health, Education, and Welfare is the family. The family based on the marital communion of father and mother, of man and woman, husband and wife. That is the foundation on which everything else is built. If the family goes wrong, if the family breaks down, if the family erodes, there's nothing that can replace it. Now, when family breakdown becomes widespread, when that becomes the norm, something's going to come into that vacuum to try to fix the problem. Ordinarily, it will be government. And it'll be necessary for government to come in because the alternative is just anarchy. But when government comes in to do the job of the family, the church, the private association, the neighborhood, when government steps in to do that, it will do it badly.
That's right.
And in many ways make the problems worse.
Exactly.
So that is why the health of the institutions of civil society, what Burke called the little platoons, is critical to all of us, not just the poor. So, for example, conservatives who rightly want, as I do, I know you do, limited government, have got to understand that limited government is only possible when the institutions of civil society are functioning and are healthy. When they are not, when they're allowed to break down, if we live in some libertarian fantasy world where it's just individualism, we don't care what's going to happen in private choices among people, and we allow institutions like marriage and the family to break down or to be redefined out of existence, when we do that, you can give up on limited government. Because in the circumstances that will ensue, with all the pathologies that are going to come with the breakdown of the institutions of civil society, beginning with the family, government's going to have to step in. And I stress, have to step in, because the alternative is chaos and anarchy. And there goes the ideal of limited government. So, if you want limited government, as we should, if you want people to flourish, as we should, then our first attention's got to be to the institutions of civil society, and they have been very badly weakened. Not simply in urban, largely minority communities, which Daniel Patrick Moynihan noticed as far back as 1965, the breakdown of marriage, the family, affecting black inner city communities. They affect not only urban, largely minority communities, but old Rust Belt cities, white working class communities in places like that, in Appalachia and elsewhere in rural America. We're seeing the same phenomena that Moynihan put his finger on and tried to call our attention to in 1965, now in white working class communities, either in old cities or in rural areas, which shows us that this is not just about race. As Bob Woodson says, it's about class. And Bob, if I can add something to it, it's about culture.
Oh yeah.
Matters. And that means that we need to be concerned about culture. We need to be concerned about the impact of policy on culture, especially the culture of marriage and the family.
Mr.
Robbie,
Woodson,
I'd like to just, if I could, add a footnote to what you just said to reinforce and support what you're saying. In our scholars in 1776, we went back and looked at 6 major plantations. What was the state of the families of slaves once they relieved? 75% of those slave families had a man and a woman raising children. Right after slavery, there was a rush to marriage. And
Which
for
they
a
had been
century,
deprived.
and for
One
a
of the worst
century
aspects of-
afterwards, the family thrived. In fact, the studies that we've done in 1930 to 1940 during the Depression, when the unemployment rate in the Black community was 40%, we had the highest marriage rate of any group in society. And so there is not true what the left, the radical left is saying today, that the decline in the Black family is related to a legacy of slavery and discrimination. That is a lie. We have the demonstrated proof that it was the strength of the Black family and its Christian faith that was a shield against racism when it was enshrined in law and economic deprivation. None of those were it was cultural practices within the community that held us together. And those continued up into the 60s. But, and that's when the decline began to occur, when policy reinforced the separation of work from income. It was the demonization of the nuclear family as being Eurocentric and therefore racist. That's when the decline occurred. So the cultural fabric was ripped apart, and policies reinforced that dislocation.
as we were planning this panel, we discussed the famous 1977 essay, To Empower People, by Peter Berger and Richard Newhouse, in which they argue that mediating institutions are essential for a vital democratic society. And the role of public policy is to protect and foster these institutions while utilizing them for the realization of social purposes wherever possible. Berger and Newhouse in this essay identify 4 key institutions as essential for addressing the problems of modern society while reducing the footprint of government. And those 4 institutions are neighborhood, family, church, and voluntary associations. I want to start with neighborhood. Representative Parker, in your view, what role does the neighborhood play in promoting the good of those who live in those neighborhoods?
Well, you know, my goodness, Bob and Robbie had such incredible comments, and what a privilege it is to be with them on the panel here today. But, you know, neighborhoods play an enormously important role. I mean, the comment was made earlier by my colleagues that government can't solve all of our problems. It can't. It can't be there to help and comfort a family that is struggling, be it with illness or economic challenge because a father is laid off or what have you. You've got to have a sense of folks around you that really care about you and your destiny. And so that's the beauty of a high quality neighborhood and the way that was described in years past, where neighbors knew one another, everyone engaged, everyone knew what was taking place with the family. And so, you know, a neighborhood in my mind is those individuals that interact with you, that are around you, you know, each and every day, that know what's really happening within your own individual family dynamic. They're there to support you when you don't have your broader family around. And so those bonds of friendship and commitment to fellow man are really nurtured best in those neighborhoods. And sadly, in the modern era, too often those bonds have been strained and have been broken. And so we need to do everything in our power to work to heal them. But again, that's not the role of government. That's the role of wonderful organizations like Bob runs and leads on the ground, helping. It's the role of our churches and wonderful nonprofits that are helping these people that are challenged with great difficulty. But again, I just can't stress enough that government cannot solve these problems. And that's why it's so important that the creation of the family in the first place is the essential building block of all the success that we've ever had historically as a nation. And it will continue to be the real, I think, assessment piece with whether or not the 21st century is as successful as the 20th century for the country. Are we able to strengthen and reinforce the family and that sense of community and neighborhood. So thank you so much for the opportunity, Andrew, to answer the question. But my colleagues, Bob and Robbie, will have so much more greater insight with their years of extraordinary service to the nation.
And Mr. Woodson, over the years, you've documented exactly what Representative Parker was talking about, the successful uplift of low-income neighborhoods using conservative values and principles. Why hasn't the conservative movement been able to politically benefit from this confluence of interests?
Well, when I went to American, the first conservatives I ever met was Peter Berger and James Q. Wilson. And it was at the Lerman Institute when they were putting together. They invited 4 activists like myself together. And I remember my first debate and discussion with James Q. Wilson. And Robbie was talking about culture. And at the time, he was talking about the way you reduce crime is increase the cost of crime. And then if you increase the penalties, it will go down. And I had this debate. I said, listen, threatening the people I know with penalties is like threatening a kamikaze pilot with death. Death is what they do. The only way that I've seen young men who are predators become ambassadors of peace is when they have been led to redemption and began to appreciate and value the quality of life. And therefore, once they get invested in life, then they don't want to take it or lose it themselves. And so what I then studied is how redemption and transformation is engendered in these young people, and that's what I wrote about. But unfortunately, conservatives flirted with it a while, but it became almost under Reagan, under both Bushes, it became almost conservative charity. It was pushed to the side as private sector initiatives, 1,000 points of light. It was not really taken seriously as worthy of investment. And conservatives limited themselves to writing about what the left is doing wrong. So Charles Murray, Larry Need, all these people, when you read their books, all they do is criticize what the left is doing, and then they limit themselves to saying, well, we need to provide restrictions on government. I wrote in '83 for the Heritage Foundation assessing Reagan's. I said, when you just cut existing programs, you're a low budget liberal. What you need to do is reform. And so, so the challenge today is to recruit conservatives who have an action agenda that goes in and really demonstrates conservative principles. We have too much reliance on good ideas are fine and worthy, but people want to see a sermon. They want to see what a value, a virtue, and a principle looks like as an instrument of transformation. And I can give you 2 examples where conservative activists actually came in and profited politically. Dick Riordan in 1990 was a conservative businessman who became the first conservative Republican in 35 years to be mayor of Los Angeles. And that's because 2 years prior to that, he came into East LA, sat down with Sister Jenny Lichtenberg, a liberal Democratic nun, who was working with low-income Hispanics who wanted to learn English. And he recruited his friends and built a world-class facility in that community and responding to their needs. Then he planted charitably and he profited politically, but you don't plant and harvest in the same year. So once they saw that he was listening to them and built an institution in response to their needs, they then in turn rewarded him by supporting him through 2 terms. Steve Goldsmith did the same thing in Indianapolis. But the Republican Party and conservatives never sat and listened to Dick Riordan or Steve Goldsmith. They were never brought to the table, supported, and determined what lessons we can learn from them. And so when you come in and you partner, Jack Kemp was the only one who did this. But we must change and invest and establish strategic relationships. When we see evidence of American virtues in action, like one quick example of a black woman who has 2 daughters living in a homeless shelter and sleeping in the back of her car and studying. The girls were studying by the light of the cell phone, but they graduated the salutatorian, the valedictorian, and started college as sophomores because they took so many advanced placement classes. Well, our scholars ought to be interviewing them, trying to find out what about their resilience. What is it that they did that can provide clues to what others could do? But we ignored it. And I can give you 7 to 10 or 20 examples of people in those environments who have achieved against the odds, who are ignored by our scholars.
Well, I want to take that as a jumping off point. At the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we don't shy away from difficult questions. In fact, we challenge those questions head on. And one of the most difficult questions that America has been wrestling with over the last year is this issue of race relations. And Mr. Woodson at the outset said it's not an issue of race, it's an issue of class. I want to ask all of our panelists, what are some examples of conservative leaders and organizations that have successfully formed alliances with low-income and minority groups to address some of these questions and challenges that the society as a whole has been addressing this last year? And that's for anybody.
Well, the best example is the work of Bob Woodson in Milwaukee and elsewhere. You want to know what to do? Look at what Bob Woodson and his folks are doing where they operate, beginning in Wisconsin. There's the model. You cannot simply go to people whose institutions of civil society have been devastated and have broken down and tell them the answer to your problems is limited government. Now, I say this as a limited government conservative, but I say it also as a civil society conservative, which is what Dan and Bob are, and what Richard Newhouse and Peter Berger were. Civil society conservatives. We believe in limited government, but we need to explain why we believe in limited government. We believe in limited government because we think civil society can do it better. It's civil society, to use the title of the Berger and Newhouse book, that empowers people. Civil society does it. Government can't. But when people are desperate, when civil society is broken down, I have to repeat myself, people are going to look to government. And when you come in and say, well, we're going to take government out of the picture, and you don't say anything about what you're going to do to replace it, you don't say anything about how you're going to rebuild civil society, you say nothing about how you're going to get resources into the hands of people who can rebuild civil society institutions, well, people are not going to be very interested in you or in voting for you or in voting for your candidates. So our message has to be limited government, not just for its own sake, but for the sake of protecting the autonomy and rebuilding the authority of institutions of civil society so that they can play their essential health, education, and welfare functions. They can do it better than government can, but not if they don't exist, not if they're allowed to completely break down. And look, I'll tell you something else. I'm sorry to be preachy here, but you've got me on something I'm hot about.
Please keep preaching.
We conservatives need to be willing to speak the truth, the whole truth.
That's right.
Truth. And it's hard today because when you speak up for things like the importance of the family, when you speak up for marriage, when you talk about the importance of children growing up with a mom and a dad, you're going to get heat. You're going to get heat now from the left. You're going to get it from the left that's culturally empowered, who own Hollywood, the news media, the big corporations, woke capital is for real, the big foundations. They're not going to be handing out MacArthur fellowships anymore for people who say the things Bob Woodson says, believe me. So you're going to get heat, but we're going to need the courage to tell the truth. We need to tell the truth to the people on our own side, and we need to tell the truth to the left and stand up for those who say it doesn't matter what the family structure is, or that it doesn't matter that we have intact two-parent families. those things do matter, and they matter most to the people who are most vulnerable, whether they are black or white or Latino or American Indian or whatever they are. The people who are the most vulnerable are the people most at risk of the collapse of civil society, the people who most need the institutions of civil society to play their essential roles. So we're gonna have to speak up. In the same way, we have to speak the truth about racism, the whole truth, to people who deny it and to people who exaggerate it. We have to speak the truth about it. It's there and it's gotta be dealt with, but it's not the cause of every problem today. We have to be bold to speak that truth. We also have to speak truth about marriage, the family, the impact of the pornography culture on the destruction of the family. People don't want to talk about that. People are afraid to speak up about that. Let's have some courage. Let's tell the truth.
And I really think, Robbie, to augment what you're saying, is that we have to also develop a relationship with different messengers. See, the radical left are really using the black community and the civil rights, and using America's birth defect of race as a bludgeon to undermine civil society. And so that's why we think, since they were using the issue of race, that the messenger to push back against it should also be black. That's why 1776 is led by 23 plus black scholars, but also activists. So we are providing the pushback, but we're not offering just an alternative debate. We're offering an alternative narrative that is inspirational and aspirational to encourage people. But two of the most, as far as I'm concerned, most troublesome groups in society are self-flagellating, guilty white people. And entitled, rich, angry blacks with their victim books. Yes. And so, to help you along with your racial struggle, those of you who are struggling with privilege, I am a certified racial exorcist. Certified, and also I've been given the authority by the Black Tie Council of Black America to absolve all of you on this telecast from racial discrimination in the past. I absolve you of your sins. Now go forth and multiply. Tell everybody that racism, the whole race issue, is a phony issue. There's no such thing as institutional racism. It is demeaning to blacks. It's an insult to say that we have to have the standards lowered in order for us to compete. It's a militant expression of self-doubt and a confession of inferiority. People are proudly standing up and saying, I'm inferior. That's why I need reparations. No, you must, as Robbie was saying, you must summon the courage to speak up against this foolishness. But also, if we were to we spent $100 billion trying to get people elected to office. If a fraction of that were invested in some of these institutions within the black community and white community, that will help them to build from within. And so that I really think the messengers pushing back against this race grievance should be, for instance, we're organizing 500 black mothers who lost children to urban violence, so that they are going to push back and say, we support the police. We are not for defunding the police. 82% of all blacks are against defunding the police. 62% of blacks, when asked whether or not racial discrimination is a persistent barrier to you, say, no, it is not. And so we as conservatives must ally ourselves and develop strategic relationships with these grassroots leaders. And we're bringing together J.D. Vance and Clarence Page for an event this April in Ohio, because there's that low-income whites and low-income blacks have more in common than do the elites on either side have with them.
Can I jump in on that point, Bob? Because as you know, I grew up in West Virginia in the heart of Appalachia.
Right.
And if there's something I hate, it's this. Seeing people try to pit poor and working class black people and other minority people against poor and working class white people.
That's right.
I hate that when white supremacists do it, and there are white supremacists, and they do try to do that. And I hate it when people on the left do it. And I hate it when people who are white do it, and I hate it when people in black do it. I hate it. Because, as Bob said, poor and working class people, and really everybody else in this country, has a common interest, and that is in having a decent, healthy, functioning civil society at the foundation of our democracy. Tocqueville noticed as early as the 1830s that American democracy depends on the functioning of the little platoons, of the institutions of civil society. We will not only lose limited government, we will lose our democratic republic if we let civil society continue to collapse. And it's that collapse of civil society that provides the predicate for those, whether they're again white supremacists or left radicals, who are trying to pit poor and working class black folks against poor and working class white folks. And we have to stand in the gap, really, against that. If I can make
But that's exactly what we're planning to do. In the past 39 years, we have 2,500 low-income grassroots leaders in 39 states, many of them Appalachian whites and blacks. And in all of the years that we've come together at conferences, we've never had racial conflict come up, because 80% of my closest friends have X's in front of their names, not letters in back of their names. And so what they deal primarily with is they give their journey from brokenness to redemption. So what they have in common is their journey towards redemption and renewal. And that's what we ought to be investing in. And that's what we're going to be doing, and take that out. The biggest enemies of that are elites on the left and the right, who are using these groups and pitting them against one another. Every white living in a trailer park who voted for Trump is not a racist.
Professor George brought up Alexis de Tocqueville.
If I could add one thing to
Sure.
what Bob said, because Bob brought up redemption, and of course that's a theological concept. Let me say just a brief word about that. St. Paul teaches that there are three great theological virtues. We call them theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. And he says the greatest of these are love. And far be it from me to argue with St. Paul or the Bible. But I want to stress, and I think it's important to our discussions of politics and policy, that if you want a firm foundation for hope and love, then look to faith. Faith is ultimately the only secure foundation for hope and love. You want to destroy hope? Destroy faith. You want to destroy love? Destroy faith. You want to build those virtues, other virtues up, you need to build up faith. So here I need to call on religious leaders, black and white. The black church has been the anchor of the black community in the most adverse circumstances of racism, deeply institutionalized racism for much of our history, and of poverty. It's been the black church that's had the leading role. But our churches have been victims in recent years of self-inflicted wounds. The scandals in I'm a Catholic, I can tell you the scandals in the Catholic Church have taken the Catholic Church off the field of cultural battle at the time when the witness of the church is most needed. And what's true of the Catholic Church is true of other Christian churches. It's true of in the Jewish community. It's true really across the board. Those self-inflicted wounds have deeply damaged us. But it's not time. In fact, there's no excuse for simply wallowing in guilt or self-pity about that. We need to get those institutions of faith operating again so that they can provide for people the foundation of hope, which people desperately need, and love.
Well,
Bobby, you're absolutely right. I can tell you it is the foundation of faith that explains our ability to push back against violence, against despair. It is faith.
And period, end of story. It begins and ends with faith, right? I mean, it is the cornerstone of a civil society. It's the cornerstone of the family and all the things that we're talking about. I'm so proud to hear my colleagues, and they've been talking about these things for years. And now, for those of you who didn't know Bob and Robbie before today, now you know why I was so honored and blessed to have them participate in making government work. They're two of the most brilliant and passionate speakers in America on how we heal the family, how we heal community, the fundamental essence of the truth, which is that only faith can heal. Only the Lord can heal. And so, when we hear these things that politicians have to tell the people straight what is going on, that's exactly right. And for too long, we've run from the truth about these timeless principles. And so this is really about reteaching and retraining these timeless principles that are enduring, to take the broken and to help them have the chance to take that pathway that Bob referred to redemption and to being healed. But all of that only happens when it's predicated on telling the truth and these fundamental foundational beliefs that we know are the cornerstone of success. And so, I'm just so proud to be a part of this discussion with the two of them. I apologize if I have to step out early due to some voting here on the floor of the House of Representatives, but I just want everyone to recognize that there is no better model. Your question, Andrew, was what organizations or models can we look to that we can deploy across the country to address these problems? And the model, my friends, is the hero watching that is with us today that I'm looking at, my good friend Bob Woodson. He is the model. We need to multiply his efforts in all 50 states and all the major cities in America. That's how we ultimately win what's taking place, and we protect this incredible democratic republic that we're so blessed to have. And we'll lose it. It's like President Reagan said, freedom doesn't run in the bloodstream. It is not passed down from one generation to another. These are only attributes that are achieved through hard work, through passion, through providing options when government is not the solution.
I could sit here all day and just let these guys go because I feel like I'm in church right now, but I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A before we shift to lunch. But before I do that, I'd like to have each of our panelists briefly answer a question that Mr. Woodson posed to us all when we were planning this conversation. What should a conservative victory based on the principles that we've discussed today mean for the least of God's children? And this is for all the panelists.
Well, let me jump in first and just comment, because I'm going to save the balance of my time for these two distinguished gentlemen to comment. I think the takeaway is that for the least of us amongst us, that we as conservatives care about the least amongst us, the challenges that they face. Don't let the left, don't let the radical media inform people that we don't care as conservatives about what's really happening. We do care. We care passionately. In fact, in the book, Making Government Work, I have a chapter on the social fabric, and it's things that conservatives are doing to advance the fight on all these topics. From stopping the horrible crimes against humanity of human trafficking, to what we do with regard to preventing and stopping sexual abuse, preventing it altogether, to helping people have access, those in clinical trials that historically have not had access due to their financial situation in life, that they've not had the ability to have access to cutting-edge medical therapies to be able to have a chance to save their life. Whatever the application may be, when it comes to those that amongst us are the most vulnerable, conservatives care. Push back. Tell the truth. Don't let the liberal narrative be sold to the American public, because it's just not true. These gentlemen are phenomenal conservatives on the battle lines every day. Professor George is much too modest. Yes, he's one of the greatest academics in the history of the country. One of the most greatest conservative academics in the nation is the McCormick Scholar at Princeton and all that he's done for academia. But he's also on the front lines. The front lines take different shapes. It's Bob being literally physically on the ground, but it's also Robbie and what he's doing, all the writing and all the teaching and working with our young people. Look, make no mistake about it. The battle for our society, for the hearts and minds and the souls of our people, in maintaining all that we love, these traditional civil traditions, all comes down to our ability to communicate and to educate our young people. That's where we're losing it. You know, if you ask me if I had a crystal ball, what my hope is with regard to making government work, it's that millions of young people will actually read the content from Bob Woodson and Robbie George. Because if they don't get fortified in good content, they're not going to make good decisions in life. And so, you know, that's my belief, is that we just got to push back on the liberal narrative and let people know that conservatives care deeply and passionately about the least amongst us.
Professor George, what does a conservative victory mean to the least of these?
I'm like Bob Woodson. I grew up, I was brought up in the liberal democratic tradition in the hills of West Virginia. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners and railroad workers, union men, Democrats. We believed in the old-time religion of Rooseveltian democratic politics. I became a conservative as an adult, not because I stopped caring about the poor, but precisely because I cared about the poor first. And I could see that the programs and the policies and the attitudes, cultural as well as political, that were represented on the left were hurting the very people that they were supposed to be helping. I don't want to doubt anybody's good intentions or goodwill. I'm with Bob on this. Bob says we have well-intentioned programs. I know those programs are well-intentioned, but they failed. And they failed in ways that actually hurt people. So I found myself shifting gradually over to the conservative side. But I think as conservatives, we need to make sure we understand what are the ends and what are the means, and not confuse the end and the means. Limited government is less an end in itself than it is a means to something else. What else? The autonomy, the integrity, the authority of the institutions of civil society. We want government out so that those institutions can do their jobs. Not because we want to abandon people to predation, quite the contrary. We know that the pathway to human flourishing, to protection of especially vulnerable human beings, people in vulnerable communities, is with healthy, flourishing institutions of civil society. We want government out of the way so the family can do its job and not have its authority usurped by government, which is happening more and more, by the way. We want government out of the way so the church can do its job, so institutions like Bob's can do their jobs. Let's not confuse the means and the ends. Why do we want freedom? Well, freedom has some value in itself. No one's going to deny that. But freedom is not freedom from exclusively. Freedom from is freedom for. We want freedom for excellence. We want freedom so that people do the things they need to do to live flourishing lives, so that they can accomplish the things that represent their true human potential. Sometimes we just get confused about means and ends, and we don't want to mix those things up. We have to make sure that at the end of the day, we understand the ends as precious human beings and their lives and their flourishing. Now, the conservative libertarian instinct is correct that we shouldn't be leading people's lives for them. People need to lead their own lives. People need to be responsible for their own decisions. That's all true, but it's people in the end. It's their flourishing, it's their well-being that counts. Other things are means. We should care about those other things, but not for their own sakes, but for their impact on our precious fellow human beings.
Mr. Woodson, appropriately, you get the last
Very
word.
quickly, I outlined some of these just to give me a chance for a commercial. In my new book, Lessons from the Least of These, that is on Amazon, I identify 10 principles that you can follow to answer that. But also that the foundation of what we do at the center is based on my book on the triumphs of Joseph. Joseph, as you know, I won't tell the whole story, but Joseph, even though he was unjustly imprisoned and served there many years, he did not succumb to bitterness, nor did he lose his faith in God. And his actions resulted in the saving of the brothers who betrayed him and the Egyptians that enslaved him. That's the kind of radical grace and action that we must take to put aside our past to deal with what are the promises of the future. And people are motivated to change when you show them a vision of victories that are possible, not injuries to be avoided. So we must take concrete action to invest our time, our money, and our commitment to work in tandem with the Josephs of this world. And that's when, just as the good Pharaoh worked with, if it wasn't for the good Pharaoh, we wouldn't have had Joseph. So we need people of means to come together with the poor Josephs of this world in order to reclaim our country.
Wonderful. Well, we have a precious few minutes for Q&A. I want to abide by the TPPF golden rule on Q&A. A question is a brief statement that ends in a question mark.
So real quick, I'm a small business owner. I believe in capitalism because of all the things we talked earlier. However, my question is, well, preface that, we all know that capitalism has no moral stance. By definition, it's a delivery system. It's nothing more. Should never be used, nothing more than that. Does anybody in the panel or anybody here, or you, Andrew, watch the video, The Social Dilemma? It's a 2-hour, but you watch 15 minutes of it, and it'll explain why our children, especially the poor, I'm also a CASA volunteer, so I hang out with the CPS kids, is that the technology has hijacked our kids, man. And has anybody watched this video? And if they haven't, they should. But more importantly, if you have watched it, what are we going to do about it?
Thoughts on the role of technology, I think, is the question.
I myself am not familiar with the video, but I will certainly look at it. Irving Kristol, the great conservative thinker, the great neoconservative thinker and social critic, famously said 2 cheers for capitalism. Why not 3? Well, it's exactly the reason that the questioner noted, which is that it's a delivery system. It's again, not an end in itself. It's a means. It's a means to extraordinary prosperity. It has lifted millions of people out of poverty. Socialists don't want to acknowledge that. Socialism has mired millions upon millions of people in poverty, and the market system has lifted millions out of poverty. But still, 2 cheers, not 3. At the end of the day, it's fallen and frail and fallible like other human institutions. It can't be the end-all and be-all. It's a means and not an end. But we need to make sure that markets are working for people, that they're properly regulated, to avoid the kind of decay into crony capitalism that has been on the most vivid display for much of my lifetime, and certainly couldn't be missed in 2008, 2009, when the curtain was pulled back. And we see how much of contemporary capitalism is not actually markets functioning, quite the opposite. It's the use of political power for people to enrich themselves and to protect their own interests and their own control of markets and share of markets at the expense of people who would like to have an opportunity fairly to compete. When I see woke capitalism, I see a lot of plutocracy. I see a lot of self-protection. I see a lot of the use of big government in order to protect private interests. Well, that's not the sort of capitalism that we should be embracing. Quite the contrary. If we believe in markets, as we should be pushing back hard against that kind of cronyism, hard against the sort of oligarchy you're seeing today in the tech industry.
Another question from the audience?
Just one quickly.
Go for it.
In our studies, we found that there were 20 blacks who were born slaves who died millionaires, and 2 of them went back and purchased a plantation in which they were slaves.
Oh, wow.
Only in America.
What is that?
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am.
Good morning. I have a question, which is based on your emphasis on faith. All 3 of you have placed great emphasis on faith. Is there a role or a place for atheists and agnostics?
Well, of course.
I think what I'm impressed with, I don't know the faith of my grassroots, but I judge people's faith by their action. You know, if you are fair to people, if you're ethical with people, you know, that's what's important to me. How you treat me.
Yeah,
I
I
would
myself
say-
in my academic writings have defended the religious liberty rights of atheists, as I did as a practitioner in chairing the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Our country is built on religious freedom, and that includes
Right.
the freedom not to believe. And when I made the point I made about the importance of faith and love and what's at their foundation, I noted that the only secure foundation is faith. Now, I know and you know unbelievers who are loving and who are kind and who are generous.
And decent people.
Yeah, and they've got to be honored, and their rights are equal to ours. There's no inequality here. That's our constitutional
That's right.
principle. Now,
Absolutely.
will that be a secure basis for it? I often have conversations with my friends who are unbelievers, as you can imagine, living in the part of the world that I live in as a professor at an Ivy League university. I know a few unbelievers. I sometimes press them on what the foundation is for their ethical views, the ultimate foundation is for their generosity, which I recognize, and their kindness, which I recognize. And it gets very, very fuzzy and hard for them to explain. It's kind of a feeling which really makes me think for a lot of people, we're just living on the capital of a religious foundation, of a Judeo-Christian civilization. And that capital can easily be depleted. There have been some great scholars who themselves are unbelievers who've made the point that religion seems to be the only secure foundation for decency going forward with people. Over the long term, if you don't have a belief in the dignity of the human being, grounded in the idea of the human being made in the image and likeness of God, it's going to be hard to sustain a commitment to honoring people who are not like you, or who disagree with you, or have different beliefs than you do, or a different political ideology than you do. You're going to tend to see people as enemies, and no tradition stepping forward to say you have to love your enemies. That's the problem.
Mr. Woodson, Professor George, Representative Parker, I wish we had many more hours to spend with you today. Thank you for your work, for the wisdom that you've shared with us. For those of you here, thank you for joining us, and please head down to the Zlotnick Ballroom for our lunch keynote. Thank you all.
Thank you.